It's actually something completely different. It's a different Hebrew word. It's a different thing completely. One of those things that actually, when I started studying this, I was only kind of thinking about commenting on this verse actually, and I was actually going to comment about the memorial stones. And then when I started studying it, not quickly, but at some point, it started to become clearer and clearer that this isn't talking about the memorial stones at all. You know, the stones, like when they crossed the Jordan, the priests were supposed to, one from each tribe, were supposed to pick up a stone and set them up as a memorial. It's not talking about that. This is talking about how later on, after they had come into the promised land and they had begun to conquer the promised land and take the land, this is talking about the fact that God actually had the people go out and survey the land. And they surveyed the land and they divvied it up to the tribes. And then they put markers. They put survey markers. And these markers are distinct and different from the memorial stones. So we're not going to talk about the memorial stones. And in some ways, there's some commonalities between the two. But being that this is actually distinct from the memorial stones, if you've ever considered that concept before, this is going to be a little different, because I think this, trying to be true to the concept, it's going to be distinct here. So I want to just say this from the outset, that there are a lot of ways that our culture and the world is and are removing the ancient landmarks, okay? And from the outset, I'll just say this, that these are God's landmarks, and we're going to have points later on, Lord willing, and those points, the advancement, is it running? Thank you. The advancement of, say, like, a lot of the agendas that are out there. A lot of those are progressive, you know. A lot of people don't know this, but like the Occupy Wall Street thing, do you guys know that, like, they went down and interviewed a lot of those people, and a lot of those people were being paid really, really well to do that? Do you know who was paying them? George Soros, through one of his dummy companies. And a lot of these people who are going into places like Ferguson and going into places like Charlotte are actually paid instigators, largely through George Soros's dummy companies. So don't get progressive. No, that's not really the point. Though I would never get progressive, because he's like, he could be the Antichrist. He's not the Antichrist. But he has a healthy dosage. He has a healthy dose of the spirit of Antichrist. And this is not actually a political spiel. I'm not actually saying that. What I want you to understand is that there is this massive push in our culture, and it's probably through the seasons of human history, it has always been this way. The devil is always trying to push humans en masse or in large groups away from God's truth, away from civilization based on God's precepts. From the very beginning, the devil was trying to do that. Well, now it's also going in our culture, and I'm not saying the progressive movement is the only place for it. It's evident in many other movements in culture, but it's actually becoming really popular and kind of in a sick way. This idea of making progress and leaving the ancient landmarks behind, the things that divided us, you know. And I'm not talking about racism here. I'm talking about the things that are biblical, as far as redefining what love is, and the whole transgender movement and all of these things. That's changing, moving the ancient landmarks. Those were things that were certitudes. And the transgender movement might actually be new. That might be one of the relatively new things, where that is like a certitude in humanity. It always has been, at least as far as I am aware, that the idea that a man is a man and a woman is a woman has been certainty. And that is, in a lot of ways, an ancient landmark, something that was ordained by God and set certain boundaries in humanity between people and about people. And if you're following what I'm saying, I'm trying to, by giving this illustration, kind of explain the relevance of what the landmarks were. Again, it's not really memorial stones. It's not at all memorial stones. It's talking more about the boundary lines that were God ordained for people, around people, and defined people, who they are, and the bounds, the limits of their existence. And those things are being moved. Now, all of that being said, I'm actually, believe it or not, going to spend our time tonight focusing on all the ways the landmarks are being moved. I'm sure we could have a question and answer time, and you guys could give 20 different, very legitimate things, probably on the top of your head right now, of landmarks, God-defined certitudes, things that were placed by God in culture, in civilization, and they're being moved currently, and we're aware of that. But when we look at the scriptures, I become more interested in the paradigms at work behind that, not so much the details or the particulars, but I become more interested in the meta narratives and the dynamics working behind the scenes, because I think those are the things that will give us clarity moving on. So I have 4 effects of removing the ancient landmarks that I want us to consider tonight. 4 effects, four consequences of removing the ancient landmarks. 4 consequences or effects. Firstly, landmarks are reference points. Now, this was not, I want to make it clear, this was not the primary meaning of the landmarks, but it's one of the lesser meanings, and so I'm going to start with it because it's not as necessarily as weighty of an issue. But I want to start here that say that people started going throughout the nation of Israel, and they started taking those landmarks and moving them. Someone might be walking down the street, or the road, the next week, and that landmark's not there, or a few months later, 6 months later, and they could lose their reference point. And so landmarks are a reference point. And when removed, these landmarks take away people's reference points for civilization, for their lives. And they start, I want to make this really clear that we're being basically figurative, though, that they get lost spiritually and intellectually, and it leads to this lostness that is all around us. People, in their honest moments, sing about it, they write about it, they talk about it in their honest moments, though most of their lives they try and cover up the lostness that they feel, but it's largely because they have removed the reference points. And so real quick, I want to give one example of what we have lost. And some of you are going to be aware of this because I've used this example before. But to give this example, I want to use the reference point, the landmark of heaven and hell, of eternal judgment. Either you're going to one place or the other. You're living forever. You're either living forever, or dying forever. And this, as John Lennon said, I don't know if you've ever noticed that song where he talks about, you might say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. Do you guys know how wicked that song is? Anybody know how wicked that song is? Has anybody actually read the lyrics? Because it's completely anti-Christian. The whole basis of the song is anti-God, anti-Christian. He's talking about, let's Chad, you could probably say later, but the whole thing of let's pretend that there's no heaven to fear, there's no hell to fear, and no heaven above, and all this stuff, and we are all that there is. And it didn't start with John Lennon, but he popularized it to some degree. But this thing of there's no heaven and there's no hell, Richard Dawkins writes about and Sam Hunt, they write about the freedom that you experience when you throw off the constraints of believing in heaven and hell and those types of things. But these people, they don't understand one of the things that they're giving up is this idea of a reference point. So let me give an illustration, and it's not going to be a new illustration for some of you. Let me preface this by saying this is not a true story. I'm not actually going to do this, but I'm going to talk like I'm going to do it, okay? Josh knows where I'm going. So, my neighbor, 3 houses down on the right side of my street several years ago, because he knew I was a pastor and a fine, upstanding Christian, enlisted my help in burying a very large sum of money under his garage. He was a little bit older, and he couldn't quite handle a jackhammer, and so he knew that I was a pastor and not the greedy type, and so he enlisted my help late one night to wet saw his garage floor and to jackhammer it up and then bury $2.5 million in a suitcase under his garage floor and then concrete over it and paint over it so that you can't even tell it's there. So I have decided that I'm kind of tired of working really hard and not getting very far, and I'm tired of the responsibilities of a father, and I think I need to be looking out a little bit more for numero uno. So tomorrow night, in the middle of the night, I'm going to break into his house, and I'm going to shoot him in the head with my handgun, and I'm going to take the money, and I'm going to get on a plane, and I'm going to fly to a Central American country and live the rest of my life out in pleasure and freedom, without any responsibility. Not a true story, okay? However, supposing it was true, it's essentially the basis to several movies. I probably shouldn't reference them, but Training Day, I'm not saying watch that movie, but it's actually the basis of Training Day. That's what he was going to do. That's what Denzel was going to do in the movie. And so it's not a foreign concept, but here's the thing. Without invoking heaven or hell or God's existence, I want you to convince me I shouldn't do it. And I literally want you guys to offer me reasons I shouldn't do it. There are only 3 reasons you can give, and none of them are sufficient.
They'll catch you and put you in jail for a long time?
Okay, that's one reason. Without invoking God, that's one reason. Why shouldn't I do it?
Central American countries are awful, and you should go to South Africa.
Well, I would actually go to Bali. But I would actually go to Bali.
Good,
but
right.
why shouldn't I do it?
$2 million is not enough.
Okay, $5 million.
Still not.
Because
They'll
you
catch
killed a
me.
man and it's wrong.
That's what you think. It's not what I think. It brings me pleasure. It does bring some people pleasure.
What about your family?
I don't care. They're just animals, like cows to me. I kill cows for my burgers. I don't care what happens to my family.
Turn my family into-
Half the men in this country who get married may cross this bridge with their family. They may not murder people, but they leave their family for lesser reasons. For self-fulfillment. There was a book that was written about it. A woman doing it. Eat, pray, love, right? Bored with her life. I'm just going to go off and do whatever I want. I'm bored with my family and my kids. Why shouldn't she do that? Her kids and her husband no longer make her happy. She just wants to be happy. Why should I not do it? Well, Drew gave the best argument, but it's a faulty argument because I'm smarter than the average bear, and I'll get away with it. Are you grasping the gravity of it? Because the point is that when you remove the ancient landmark of hell, when you remove it, to the person who has some sort of pathology, some sort of neurosis, they actually are masochist, or they actually find pleasure, they actually take pleasure in hurting people. They actually, they don't care what you think, and they don't care what anybody else thinks. They just want to live for themselves. What happens is we lose the ability to even call it wrong. We lose the ability to even call it wrong. There's a very, very, very famous psychologist. His name was Hobart Maurer, and I'm not going to try and quote what he quoted, but he actually ended up killing himself. He was a psychologist. He was a psychological professor at Harvard. He was at one point the most preeminent psychologist in the United States and thereby the world in the 50s and 60s. And he had quite a few depressed episodes in his life because he was largely atheistic, and so he struggled with these concepts. And one of the most important points in his life, he actually wrote for the most preeminent psychological journal of the time and essentially said, whatever happened to sin? Why are we no longer call sin, and we've considered our departure from this old ancient concept epoch making, that we have finally freed ourselves. And he said, but the problem is that we've loosed ourselves from the very definition of who we are. And he said, and I find myself in counseling sessions with psychopaths saying, who am I to even tell him that the life that he's living is wrong? Because if you don't believe in heaven or hell, in eternal judgment, and in God, you lose the ability to even stand in front of another person and say, the way you're living your life is wrong. It's hurting other people. So, you hurt cows, and I think cows are more important than people. We have a lot of people like that nowadays. Your average environmentalist thinks we should actually get rid of people, literally, so we can have more animals, because that would make them happy. In this idea here, it's not so much that the world is going to run amok, without the concept of hell, though it is. But it's not that everybody's going to start killing their neighbor necessarily. Most people are restrained by the cultural restraints, by I'll get caught, someone will catch me, or whatever, and I'll spend the rest of my life in prison, or someone will kill me, or something like that. But the reality is that when you remove the landmark of heaven and hell, everything else as far as a reference point crumbles. Because whether you realize it or not, Christian, the devil has made it so unpopular in our culture to talk about hell. He has even gotten into the church with it. When was the last time you heard the word hell said in church? I think it was when Hannah's dad preached, actually, because he preached about hell. When was the last time? I don't even like talking about it because it's become this cultural pressure. Do you know? 50 years ago, 100 years ago, I don't think you could go a month in your average church service without hearing the word hell 30 or 40 times. It was a reference point, and I'm serious. It is something we've lost. It's something that has weakened our witnessing. You want to add some power to your witnessing? Reference hell. And I'm not even necessarily saying, confront the person and saying, you're on the road to hell. Just say to them, just ask them a question and say, the Bible says that there is a place of eternal judgment for people who reject God's Son and live for themselves. Don't you at least think you should think twice about that? The possibility that a place of eternal torment exists and you can escape it simply. Don't you think that's worth giving it a second guess? And I tell you guys the truth. It's one of those ancient landmarks, the idea of eternal judgment, of hell in particular, heaven and hell, that has been largely removed in our culture and even from the church. Because we feel the pressure and we don't even like the concept of it largely. And we need to be very careful of it. Not just because culture's going to unravel, but it takes the power out of our witness. It takes the power out of our reference point. Be careful of that. So the other thing that happens, secondly, is that when you remove landmarks, people always get ripped off. Now, Proverbs 23 says this in 10 and 11. Says it's referring this same thing, just a couple verses over. Do not remove the ancient landmark, nor enter the fields of the fatherless, for their Redeemer is mighty. He will plead their cause against you. So one of the purposes that a person would remove a landmark is so that they could rip somebody off. You could say, oh no, that's my field. And they could just absorb the fatherless, the poor man next door who didn't have any ability to fight for his rights and for his field. Just remove the landmark. Oh no, this goes from there to there. That's my field. And they could take advantage of their next door neighbor, of someone who was weaker. I think at this point, so as I already referenced, one of the ancient landmarks that God ordained, the whole transgender issue, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I've kind of spent a little bit of time on it probably 6 or 7 months ago in a teaching, except to say this: someone always gets ripped off. And what's really interesting about the ancient land, this concept of removing the ancient landmark, that men are men and women are women, boys are boys and girls are girls, is that, so our culture's removing it. And I'm trying to, when Jenner did her whatever whole thing and was interviewed and all of that stuff, there was all of this, it wasn't backlash, but there was all this praise on like Twitter and everything. All these people were like, oh, he's a hero, whatever. Jenner's a hero, you're amazing, you're a hero for our times and everything. So all these people were like, yeah, we'll help you remove that landmark, that's great. Jenner wanted to, at latest point, I'm not even sure he did actually follow through with the surgery, right? But that's not even the point, because people do follow through with the surgery, okay? They actually have a surgery to try and change their gender. They're getting ripped off. You ever considered in that concept, and I don't want to delve into the details, but sometimes I think we lack power in trying to deal with the world because we're not allowed to deal with the details. And so we're not allowed to call, a rose and a turd a turd. And I think it's a shame because sometimes we need to look at something and say, dude, that is stupid. That is really dumb. You are defining your entire life by your sexuality. And in the very process of pursuing your dream, you are mutilating your very ability to enjoy it. Do you understand the irony of that?
True.
The sadness of that? Do you know that the suicide rate of a transgender person after the surgery is 20 times of the normal population? Because it doesn't fulfill. It's not only that it doesn't fulfill, they're destroying their very ability to even enjoy the most important thing about themselves. It's sad. It's really sad. And they're getting ripped off. They're getting ripped off by the people patting them on the back. They go, oh, you're a hero. Go jump off the cliff, bro. And I feel so good about myself because I patted you on the back. I'm such a good person. No, that's disgusting. That's sad that those people would pat these people on the back and call them heroes going to their doom. And I'm not just talking about eternal doom. I'm talking about ripping themselves off and being ripped off by culture who's so set on removing this ancient landmark because we don't need it anymore. And someone is always getting ripped off. Thirdly, when you remove the landmarks, people get worn out. Now follow me on this because it's going to seem like I'm not using a biblical example here for a moment, but I am going to tie this into a biblical concept. When you remove the landmarks, the boundaries, people get worn out. It's a lot like when we were in youth group and we used to make the mistake of playing soccer in the backfield without side outs. Those games would last like 35 minutes. And I was always like,
Brad.
And I was always like,
Run into the
why don't the
woods.
games last longer? Because we removed the side boundaries. And you're always chasing Evan like out into the woods, like for me, someone that's like 10 years younger than me, and I'm like getting worn out. And there's a lot of truth to the fact that people, when they remove these boundaries, and we have to be so free, and we have to be this, 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 be this. There is a very real weariness and physical exhaustion that comes upon the life of a person that is so focused on being all these things. Have you ever noticed, because this ties in very interestingly for me in Matthew 11:28 through 30, where Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest for your souls. Take my yoke upon you, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Don't you think it's kind of odd? It's an interesting juxtaposition that he's talking about taking a yoke of labor, and it's going to bring you rest. Take this yoke this yoke that's going to confine you into a role and into a position, and this yoke of labor is actually going to give you rest. Now, without spending a lot of time talking about all the other dynamics, I think there's an interesting truth in the reality that God has put boundaries, natural boundaries in your life. God ordained ancient landmarks in your life, and he says, hey, you know what, Kiana, you're a girl, and there's a heaven and a hell, and I have a role for you as a woman, and Drew, you're a guy, and I have a role for you as a guy, and there are certain things, and obviously the yoke is talking about ministry, the yoke is talking about the labor that God has for you, but it's a yoke, it's a boundary. If anything, it's this thing that sets you in a course, and you go plowing down your line, and it gives you rest. The boundary, I'm serious about this, the boundaries, interestingly enough, these boundary markers, I say boundary, you should understand that a lot of translations actually translate these words, the ancient landmark, it's actually boundary marker or landmark, whichever you want to say. But these boundaries, they actually do give us rest. But fourthly, and this one I'm going to spend a little bit more time on than the last one, life loses meaning. Life loses meaning. When you remove the landmarks, life loses its meaning. You can turn there if you want. You don't have to, but Acts 17, I'm just going to read you a short thing. The general meaning of life can be found here in Acts 17, verses 26 through 27. And I say general because I mean general to the whole world. Not really so much for you and I. You know, I think the Westminster Confession probably sums it up really well. As far as what the meaning of life is, does anybody know it? Man's chief end is to love God and to glorify God and to enjoy Him for eternity. And I think that sums it up very well, actually. For the Christian, we understand that as maybe the more specific meaning of life. But as a general meaning for life, Paul, speaking at the Areopagus, had this to say in verses 26 through 27. And He, God, has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for Him and find Him, though He is not far from each one of us. This is the general purpose of life, the meaning of life for the world. God has given them these boundary markers. He has established every single person's in the world their boundaries. And the purpose of life is not taking those boundaries and knocking them over and trying to find new lateral places to go and new things to do laterally in life and new pleasures and new this and new that. The meaning of life is to grope for, generally speaking of non-believers, and seek God in the hope that they might find Him. That's the general meaning of life. But the interesting thing is that this idea of removing the boundary markers causes people to lose the real meaning of life, because they're so focused on the world and they're so focused on pushing out their boundaries and on laterally what's going on, that they fail to understand that the real meaning of life is actually vertical. It's actually striving and groping to find the creator of the universe. Some examples of this that become very clear for me. I don't know about you guys, but I've never been much of a cheater. It's not I've never cheated. I've told you guys stories. I cheated in Spanish that one time and I got caught. But my problem is that I don't feel like it means anything. If I cheat on a test to get 100, it means nothing. I didn't actually get the 100. I got the 100 by cheating. If I'm playing a card game and I have to cheat to beat you, what did I prove? I proved nothing to myself. And I really mean this. This is just like the way that I'm made up in my mind. I'm not actually like boasting. I'm just saying this is the way I've always been. I don't see the point of playing a game against you, a sport against you, and cheating to beat you. Because if I didn't beat you fair and square, in my book, I didn't beat you. It proved nothing. It's meaningless. And my point is that when you remove the boundaries, life becomes meaningless. I think about Lexi's last game of soccer when she played last season. It was amazing. They were playing this team that it was the last game of the season, but at the first game of the season they played this team and this team beat them like 8-0. And so it was the last game of the season, and the game was like 1-1 or right around there. Lexi's team was doing really, really good. I think they still lost, but it was really cool because they came really far. Half the kids on this team were like 6 feet tall. No, not really. Lexi's only like 3 feet tall. But they had an inordinately large amount of large kids. And this team was really good, and Lexi had 2 other girls on her team that were really exceptionally good. They could kick from like half field, and they were just really, really good, and a couple of the boys too, and everybody was making shots at the goal, and they had this really big kid kind of playing goalie, even though you don't have goalies, and he was blocking all these shots, and there was a point where Lexi got past the ball. And so the ball got passed to her, and she kind of started running down the field, and she almost got like pushed out of bounds as someone's trying to and she got around this kid and she took a shot and it went right between the kid's legs, right into the goal. And like, I went ballistic. I was like, it was amazing. She hadn't scored all season, either season actually. And so I'm like jumping up and down and hollering and anything. Why did the goal have meaning? Do you understand that the difficulties overcome in the process of achieving the goal are what caused that response in us as human beings? I have to admit, like, no, I'm not going to use that illustration. If you guys are following what I'm saying, the things in life that really lift our spirit when we're watching a sports team or something and they win, when they come from behind and they win fair and square, it does something inside you. Why? Because they stayed in the boundaries. The thing that happened was substantial and meaningful because it was difficult, because it was arduous, because there were obstacles to overcome, and the people did it fairly. They did it fairly. And this principle is true about life. When people remove the ancient landmarks in life and they just go about life as though you can do whatever you want and you can cheat and you can... What the saddest thing about it, what they don't understand is they're cheating themselves because they lose the meaning in life. They find themselves, the person who removes the ancient landmarks inevitably finds themselves in their moments alone when they're honest with themselves saying, my life has no meaning. I don't even know. I don't even want to live anymore because there's no meaning. There's no point. My life is so pointless. I said that so much as a teenager after I had removed the boundaries in my life, having grown up in the church around 11 or 12. I said, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm not honoring God. I kind of believe he exists, but I'm not honoring him. Why am I sitting on the fence? If I'm not going to honor him, if I'm not going to go to heaven, I'm going to go out in style. And so I made a conscious, horrible decision at right around 11 years old to just do whatever I wanted to do and throw off all the boundaries and use girls, do drugs, do whatever, anything. And it's crazy what like a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old can do. And this was 40 years ago, And, not enough way.
Okay.
You know what's crazy, though? When I removed the ancient landmarks from my life all over the place, sex outside of marriage and all these other things, my life became meaningless. It became a baneful existence. I didn't want to live. I didn't want to wake up in the morning. I didn't want to go to school. I couldn't face reality more. It didn't have any meaning. And that galled me day after day after day. And I found myself despondent and despairing of life because life had no meaning. And what I didn't realize is that to a large degree, the meaning that we find in life comes from the boundaries. It's not only the boundaries. Obviously, in that general meaning that was given, that Paul said at the Areopagus, he said, God has established their pre-appointed boundaries, and that was part of the equation, but the whole equation includes seeking God's glory and seeking his face, and that's where we actually find our ultimate meaning. Keeping the boundaries won't in and of itself give you meaning. It will give you some semblance of meaning, and you see that with non-believers who keep the boundaries. They whether they realize it or not, they keep the Judeo-Christian boundaries. They get married, they raise kids, they love their kids, they don't cheat on their spouse, they work hard, they don't cheat on their taxes, they do all these things, and so they keep the boundaries, and they keep enough of a semblance of the meaning of life in their life to keep them at least happy and productive and not falling into despair and depression all the time. But we understand that the ultimate meaning in life is not just found by staying within the boundaries, but it is found in groping and striving and pursuing God's face. And we understand that is the ultimate meaning, but it's not really the purpose of our teaching tonight. Our purpose that we're focusing on tonight are the landmarks themselves. So as I'm closing here, I do have some points, so don't get your hopes up just yet. But as I'm closing here, why am I sharing this with you? The reason I even stopped and focused on this verse when I was doing this chapter is because I've been bothered for about a year and a half by something that's happened. and this is a bit of a subject change. At least the material that we're going to talk about now here is different. It's going to be aimed a little more closer to home. I don't think any of you have removed the boundary of gender identity or the boundary marker of eternal judgment or those things. But something's been kind of like bothering me for about a year and a half, and it in the last year and a half I've become aware of, through certain situations here and there, of a new-ish kind of thing that's going on, at least in America. And this thing is called the youth church or the young adult church. And one of the reasons I'm kind of, it's getting to me more and more now is because people have actually approached me about turning this into its own church and being like, oh, have you ever thought about, like doing like a youth church, a young adults church? And apparently there's one locally, and I know of a lot. I've become privy to a lot in the last year and a half, and I have to just starting out, I'm bothered. Okay, I've been bothered for a while about the concept, largely because in the last year and a half I've heard people your age, you guys' age, come to be like, oh, there's a revival here, and they describe it, and it sounds legit. People are getting saved, and I don't deny God is working, and this, that, and the other, and talking to them, and one I'm thinking about, all these people have gotten saved, and it's good, and it's like this house church thing, and that's fine, but it's like a young adults thing. All of the people that come to it, there's like an age thing, and I actually was not allowed to come to it, even though I was like, hey, I'd like to come and see what's going on. And the person telling me like, oh, you're too old, I can't. I'm like, really? But I'm like a pastor, I just want to like see, I'm not like going to hit on any of the girls or anything, like, I guess I didn't shave that week or something, I don't know. And so I wasn't, and I'm not bitter about that, but no. But I was, so there was like my whole point in saying that though is there was an age limit. And I have to tell you, it never sat well with me. And so that was a first instance, and I kind of was like, all right, so God's moving there, and he is moving there. And that's cool. I don't have a problem with that. But in the last year and a half, I seem to be hearing more and more and more about this concept of youth churches, of churches of young believers. And it's like, and people have approached me and been like, you should you should turn it into its own church. And I'm like, are you serious? You don't understand me at all. I understand. I get it. I get the paradigms that work in the culture. I've had it explained to me, and I understand. There are a lot of kids, a lot of young men and women your age who have been hurt in church or blah, blah, blah. Their thing. Oh, I've heard the stories. I get that. And I want to reach those people. I have no problem with that. This is a young adults group. That's good. But I have to be really honest with you that part of my vision for this group is the people who maybe come into the group and maybe have been in that situation where they've been out in the wilds and they're a Christian, but they've been hurt or they have never found a good church, whatever. My vision in that scenario is that this group would become a medium to bring those people back into a church. I'd love it if it was this church. Why? Well, I have some reasons. I have a few reasons I want to mention real quick. Skipping some of my things here. So as we're going to talk about this, I just have 3 quick points I want to say. But this landmark right here that I'm talking about, this one in particular, it's an ancient landmark, and it's the idea of the congregation of God. It was in the Old Testament, the congregation of Israel called them the congregation. In the New Testament, there's the congregation, and it's called the church, okay? And so this is an ancient landmark that we're considering, this idea of the congregation of God. So I just have a few points of why I believe the idea of a young adults church is in and of itself is flawed. I just have three reasons that I have for it, that I as I was meditating on this, that have been kind of stewing in my mind for the last year and a half as I've become more and more aware of this type of thing that's happening. Firstly, it's making church into your image. Okay? Instead of the image of Christ, because the body of believers, you're supposed to be Christ's body. And the church, instead of being Christ's body, it is being formed into the image that the people going to it want. And whether a lot of these people are not honest with themselves about it. They are not honest with themselves. But the reason I look at it and I go, one of the primary reasons it's so popular is that I can just go and everybody's like me. And this is something that's kind of opening a new idea in my mind, because in your generation, despite what the media wants to tell us about racism, I know there's still racism in our culture. There definitely is, though it goes both ways in my experience. There's a lot of racism between all kinds of people in our culture. But in your generation, there's actually not a lot of racism in your generation. I know that, in high school you get those frictions and there can be racial tensions, but there's actually not a lot of racism in your generation, not like there has been, okay? Where you guys, and if you're following me, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but what I am saying is that the interesting thing in your generation, where the devil is I believe finding a foothold in your generation, is establishing in your mindset that in the mindsets of people your age, I don't really want to hang out with a bunch of older people. I want to go to church, and I want the music to be cool and the type of music I like, and I want the lights to be the type of music I like, and I want the backdrop to be the type of backdrop that makes me happy and aesthetically pleased. And I want the people that are there. I don't want any old creepy people there. I don't want any young annoying people there. I want cool, good-looking people like me that we can go and have a good time. And if you're following what I'm saying, I'm dead serious about this. I know it's not necessarily the overarching theme of these churches, though in some ways it is, but it is unhealthy. Can I just tell you, from 20 years and having gone through your age and been through a lot of different young adults groups when I was your age and all the attempts at those types of things, can I just tell you that anything that is just centered on you, particularly if it's in the name of God and it has the pretense of being for God, but it's really for you, is very, very unhealthy spiritually, very damaging. It will turn you into a hypocrite. And you encounter these people in these groups, and they think that the group is, it's not uncommon in one of these scenarios, in one of these things, for them to be like, for someone to come to me like, oh, you gotta check out this worship band. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'll listen to one of the music. Oh no, check this video out. And they like shove the video in my eye, and I'm like watching it. I'll never forget, because this happened to me. It was the first time I became aware of Jesus culture. Someone was like, check this out. And I'm like, why do I have to watch it? It's worship music. I don't care what they're doing. I don't care what they look like. I don't care what their guitars look like. I don't care what kind of lights they have. And it bothered me. And it bothers me a lot, because in that element of the youth church, the young adults church, whatever, in that element, there is this focusing on the outward. There is an overemphasis on the outward, and it bothers me. Why does it matter what the stage looks like? I get it, okay? I get both sides. I get the seeker-friendly side. We want people to feel comfortable when they come in. I get that. But when people start trusting in it, when churches start trusting in the way it looks, and when Christians start saying to other Christians, you got to check this worship, you got to check Jesus culture out, you got to see the video. And I'm like, why do I have to see the video? Why? When did worship become in any way visual about the people? And that's a huge mistake. I believe it ties in with the concept that Paul was talking about in 2 Corinthians, I believe chapter 5, where he says, from now on we regard no one according to the flesh. And here's the truth. When Christians, when their entire church experience becomes about regarding people according to the flesh, how old they are, how cool they are, how devilish is the idea of people being cool and not even mattering. But it does. It matters to the people who like the young adult church movement. It matters. I'm telling you, it matters. It's all about regarding people according to the flesh and fitting the gospel and the Christian experience to your life and to your image. And that is incredibly dangerous and unhealthy. Points 2 and 3. Secondly, it denies God's purpose of the church in your life. And thirdly, it ignores God's purpose for you in the church. So it denies God's purpose of the church for you, and it denies your purpose in the church. So the church, it denies his purpose of the church in you and your purpose in the church. How humbling is it to come to a church where not everybody's cool? Don't you feel the bite when you walk through our doors at our church? I do. I imagine myself cooler than I actually am and younger than I actually am. And in my fleshlier moments when I walk through the doors of our church and I'm like, man, look at these old people. You know, like, why would anybody want to hang out here? You know, like anybody you guys' age. It denies God's purpose of the church in you. Do you guys understand that part of the reason he wants you to be established, anchored in a body of believers that is diverse, not just racially? That's been so overplayed. I get that. Yeah, it should be diverse racially, totally. But you know, the thing that is becoming more prevalent in the church that I see is this trending away from like the different age groups. You have churches where you walk in from behind and every head is silver, you know? And you have churches now where people are like, dude, let's start a youth church. Yeah. And everybody you walk in, everybody's got a faux hawk and whatever the popular girl style is. And it defeats God's purpose of the church in your life to bring about humility for the dissemination of wisdom. You know, Proverbs has a lot to say about the Bible has a lot to say about the gray head. But the idea, you know, if you don't pick anything else about that truth, it's that there does come experience with age. You know, that person has been through more. And those people going to those young adults churches are missing out on something massively. They're missing out on wisdom that comes through experience. It really ruins. There's so much about the church, you know, the things that are unpleasant about the church, about our church, about every church, that humble us and break us and teach us that life isn't about us. Church isn't about us. When did church become about what we want? When did it stop being a place where we come with the mentality of ministering to people? I get it, there are times when we're broken and we need to be ministered to. But when we come to church, it should be a lot less, it should be nothing about what it looks like or how aesthetically pleasing it is. It should be about ministering to people and loving people. And I'll tell you the truth, it's really hard to love people when you're so focused on yourself and what you want. It's actually, in my opinion, probably impossible. And thirdly and finally, it ignores God's purpose for you in the church. Young men and young women, God has a purpose for you in the church. And I'm not really so much preaching at you guys because I know a lot of you guys are fully involved in one way or another, or maybe you're in a season of rest, but you would want to be. And that is amazing. But two things that I noticed just as I was kind of thinking about this today that you have in your youth that people like me don't necessarily have, and that is strength. And 1 John says that. He says, I've written to you young men because you have overcome the wicked one, because you are strong and the word of God abides in you, and you have a strength. Yeah, it's primarily physical, but there is a strength in you young people, and God has a purpose for you in a church like this, in your church. And for those people your age that just become part of a youth church and they don't fellowship in a full body of believers and they don't engage in that body of believers, God wants to use you there. God wants to use you with the older people. He wants to use you with the younger people. And you have a strength, a certain strength that is valuable in that body of believers. And then finally, you have an availability. And Paul said that in 1 Corinthians 7. You know, when he was talking about, are you loose from a wife? Don't seek a wife. You know, and he said a bunch of other things, but then he comes down and he says, why am I saying this to you? To put a leash on you? To restrain you? No, but that you would be free. And that you would serve the Lord without distraction. And you guys at your age, you have an availability and a strength that God has given you that he wants to use in his church and through his church. And I think, I just say all this stuff, maybe it's not a big deal. I just think it came up this week. That's somebody else. It came up a lot recently, actually. Someone asked me somewhat recently to turn this into its own thing. And I'm just like, that sounds an awful lot like a church split, even if I believed in like the youth church thing. That sounds an awful lot like a church split to me, and not so much about, doing God's will. But aside from that, people have come up and they're just like, recently someone was like, oh, this church, the youth, it's just, and it just bothers me. And it's been bothering me for a while. And I dare say the reason that I'm sharing this with you is because I think that it's going to be a temptation for some of you in the near future. Maybe it already is, and I'm not even aware of it, because I think it's only going to grow in popularity. I think it's only going to grow in popularity because I get it. If I was your age and single and, 30, flirty and thriving or whatever, 20, flirty and thriving, dude, I would get the temptation. I get it. I understood the temptation. I wanted to go to the college group and with the cute girls, and whatever. I understand that, but I tell you guys, be careful of that, because I think it misses God's purpose in your life and for your life. And I think that it's a dangerous thing in the long run, because I think people are going to get burnt out. It's a lot like my experience at Bible college. Graduating from Bible college and leaving and coming home was a lot like, running, down a track, and then like the track stops and it's mud and you like fall into the mud. It's like, whoa. Because for like 2 years I was surrounded only by people my age who had practically no responsibility. None of us had jobs. In California, when I was at Bible college in California, we had jobs, and we kind of had jobs in Austria, but mine was amazing. Mine was grounds and maintenance, so I just spent the whole time like in the forest, like in the Alps, like moving boulders and stuff. It was cool, and chainsawing stuff. So it wasn't really that. It was like 8 hours a week. So like,
That's a short day.
so what happened is, things got really hard when I left Bible college, because Bible college was a lot like this youth church thing, where we were all freewheeling, no responsibilities, whether we realized it or not, a lot of fun all the time. And I believe the youth churches are seeking to like encapsulate that experience. And I've got to tell you guys, this is a fallen world. And God did not establish the church so that we could turn it into our own image to make us more comfortable and for it to be a place where we could go be entertained by the worship because it matters what it looks like and all this other stuff. And we could be pleased to be around people like us that make us comfortable and that we like to look at and don't make us uncomfortable, like the old lady with the curlers, and all that stuff. Dude, those people are really missing God's purpose, I think. Be careful. I think that's probably, for most of you here, the most likely landmark that the devil is trying to shift in your generation and in your culture. And so I would say beware of it. Father, I thank you for your word. Oh, I hope I did it justice, Lord. I pray that the parts of this that were you and that were the truth, that they would sink deep down into our hearts, and that they would buffer all of these young men and women from error, and that they would help them to walk straight, fully pleasing to you. In Jesus' name. Amen.